The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets against the barn door. As Ruth Ortiz pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Through the gaps in the weathered planks, she could see the dark silhouette of a man approaching, his heavy boots crunching through the snow with deliberate, measured steps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the stolen loaf of bread to her chest, knowing that discovery meant more than just hunger tonight. The barn door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo through her very bones. Moonlight spilled across the hay-strewn floor, casting long shadows that danced and shifted as the figure stepped inside. Ruth held her breath, willing herself to become invisible among the farm tools and feed sacks that surrounded her hiding place behind the old plow. "I know you're in here." The voice was deep, gravelly, with an edge that spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Brandon Bennett's words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable deliberate and certain. "The snow outside tells stories, and your tracks lead right to my door." Ruth's fingers tightened around the bread, her knuckles white with desperation. She had been running for 3 days now, ever since the sheriff had come to evict her from the small cabin she had called home. With nowhere else to go and winter closing in around the mountain settlement like a merciless fist, she had resorted to taking what she needed to survive. But this man, this mountain man whose reputation preceded him through every whispered conversation in town, had caught her. "Come out now, and we'll talk." Brandon's voice carried a strange quality, not quite as harsh as she had expected. "Stay hidden, and you'll freeze to death before morning. The storm's getting worse." As if summoned by his words, the wind howled against the barn walls, sending a chill through the gaps in the wood that cut straight through Ruth's thin coat. She closed her eyes, weighing her options. Face this man and whatever justice he deemed fit, or remain hidden and likely die from the cold that was already seeping into her bones. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The decision was made for her when her body betrayed her with a violent shiver that knocked over a metal bucket beside her hiding spot. The clang echoed through the barn like a bell, tolling her fate. Brandon's footsteps moved closer, deliberate and unhurried, until his shadow fell across her makeshift shelter. "There you are." His voice held no triumph, no anger, just a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable. Ruth looked up to see a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom in the dim light. "You'll sleep beside me tonight." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Ruth's pulse quicken for entirely different reasons. But there was something in his tone, something that spoke not of threat but of simple, practical necessity. Still, she pressed herself further against the wall, her voice barely a whisper when she finally found it. "Please, I'll leave. I'll go back to town. I won't bother you again." Brandon studied her for a long moment, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, the desperate hunger in her eyes that went far deeper than the need for food. "In this storm? You'd be dead before you made it halfway down the mountain. And I don't make a habit of letting people die on my land when I can prevent it." 3 weeks earlier, Ruth Ortiz had awakened to find an eviction notice nailed to her cabin door, the harsh black letters spelling out the end of the only life she had known since her husband's death 2 years prior. Thomas Castillo, the banker who held the mortgage, had been patient for a time, but patience, like everything else in the harsh mountain territory, was a luxury few could afford for long. She had stood in the doorway of the small cabin, reading the notice over and over, as if the words might change with repetition. The morning sun had painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and amber, a beauty that mocked the desperation growing in her chest. 24 hours to vacate. 24 hours to figure out where a widow with no family and no prospects might go when winter was already beginning to show its teeth. The town of Cedar Ridge nestled in the valley below like a collection of children's blocks scattered by a careless hand. From her cabin on the hillside, Ruth had often watched the smoke rising from its chimneys, the tiny figures of people going about their daily lives, and felt both connected to and separate from that world. Now, with the eviction notice crumpling in her trembling hands, she felt only the separation. Her first instinct had been to seek help from the few neighbors scattered across the mountainside, but pride held her back. These were hard people living hard lives, and she had already borrowed more than she could repay in the months since her husband, Jacob James, had been killed in a logging accident. The memory of his laugh, of the way he used to come home each evening with sawdust in his hair and stories of his day, threatened to overwhelm her as it always did when desperation made her defenses weak. Instead, she had packed what few belongings would fit in a single carpet bag and made her way down to town, hoping against hope that Thomas Castillo might grant her an extension, might show mercy to a woman who had never asked for anything more than the chance to grieve in the home she and Jacob had built together. The bank had been warm when she entered, a sharp contrast to the October chill that had followed her down the mountain. Thomas Castillo had looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who had been expecting her, his soft features arranged in what he probably thought was sympathetic concern. "Mrs. Ortiz," he had said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I was hoping you might come in today." Ruth had sat on the edge of the chair, her back straight despite the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. "Mr. Castillo, I need more time. Just until spring, when I can find work, when I can get back on my feet." He had shaken his head before she finished speaking, his jowls trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry, truly I am. But the bank has been more than generous. Your husband's death was a tragedy, but it doesn't change the fact that the mortgage payments are 6 months behind. I have investors to answer to, obligations of my own. Where am I supposed to go?" The question had escaped her lips before she could stop it, raw and desperate in a way that made Thomas Castillo look away. "There are opportunities for a woman willing to work. Mrs. Carter runs a boarding house, and I understand she's looking for help. It's not much, but it's honest work, and she provides room and board." Ruth had known Gloria Carter by reputation, a stern woman who ran her boarding house with military precision and little tolerance for what she considered weakness. The thought of working under her watchful eye, of being dependent on her charity, had made Ruth's stomach turn. But what choice did she have? The meeting with Gloria Carter had gone exactly as Ruth had feared. The older woman had looked her up and down with critical eyes, noting the patches on her dress, the worn soles of her boots, the way Ruth's hands shook slightly as she explained her situation. "I can offer you a position," Gloria had said finally, her voice clipped and businesslike. "Cleaning, cooking, laundry. You'll work 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset. In return, you'll have a small room in the attic and 2 meals a day. No wages for the first 3 months while you work off the debt of room and board. After that, we'll see." The terms had been harsh, bordering on indentured servitude, but Ruth had nodded her acceptance. What other option did she have? Winter was coming, and she had nowhere else to turn. But working for Gloria Carter had proven to be a different kind of hell than Ruth had imagined. The boarding house catered to traveling businessmen and the occasional family passing through, and Gloria ran it with an iron fist wrapped in false pleasantries. Ruth found herself working from before dawn until well past dark, scrubbing floors that were already clean, washing sheets that showed no signs of use, preparing elaborate meals that Gloria would invariably find fault with. Worse than the endless work was the constant criticism, the way Gloria seemed to take pleasure in pointing out every small imperfection, every moment when Ruth's grief or exhaustion showed through her carefully maintained composure. The other women who worked at the boarding house, Karen Davis and Diane Murphy, had been there long enough to develop a kind of protective numbness, moving through their tasks with the mechanical precision of people who had learned not to hope for better. "Don't take it personal," Karen had whispered to Ruth one evening as they folded laundry in the basement. "Mrs. Carter treats everyone like that. She's got a mean streak wider than the valley, and she takes it out on whoever's handy." But Ruth couldn't help taking it personally when Gloria made pointed comments about charity cases and the burden of supporting those too weak to support themselves. Each cutting remark felt like another chip taken from what remained of her dignity, another reminder of how far she had fallen from the woman she had been when Jacob was alive. The breaking point had come on a particularly cold November evening when Ruth, exhausted from a day of scrubbing the boarding house from top to bottom, had accidentally dropped a china plate while clearing the dining room. The plate had belonged to Gloria's grandmother, she learned, as the older woman berated her with a viciousness that seemed disproportionate to the offense. "Clumsy, worthless creature," Gloria had hissed, her face flushed with anger. "I should have known better than to take in someone so obviously incapable of proper work. Perhaps if you spent less time feeling sorry for yourself and more time paying attention to what you're doing, accidents like this wouldn't happen. Ruth had stood there, surrounded by the scattered pieces of china, feeling something inside her crack as surely as the plate had. The other guests in the dining room had looked away, embarrassed by the scene, while Karen and Diane had continued their work as if nothing was happening, their faces carefully blank. That night, lying on the narrow cot in her attic room, Ruth had stared at the ceiling and made a decision. She couldn't continue living like this, couldn't continue to let Gloria Carter strip away what remained of her self-respect piece by piece. She would leave, would find another way to survive the winter, even if it meant facing the unknown dangers of the mountain wilderness alone. She had waited until the early hours of the morning, when the boarding house was quiet and still, before gathering her few possessions and slipping out through the kitchen door. The November air had been sharp against her face, carrying the promise of snow, but it had felt like freedom after the stifling atmosphere of Gloria's domain. For a few days, she had managed to find shelter in an abandoned line shack on the outskirts of town, a small building that had once housed railway workers but now stood empty and forgotten. She had made it as comfortable as she could, using her own blankets and the few supplies she had managed to take from the boarding house. But the food had run out quickly, and the cold had grown more bitter with each passing night. Desperation had driven her to steal, first just small items from the general store, a loaf of bread here, some cheese there, telling herself that she would pay it back when she found work. But as the days grew shorter and the snow began to fall in earnest, her thefts had become bolder, more desperate. She had taken to watching the scattered homesteads and farms around the valley, learning the routines of their inhabitants, waiting for opportunities to take what she needed to survive. It was during one of these desperate forays that she had first heard the name Brandon Bennett spoken in hushed, fearful tones. The mountain man who lived alone in a cabin high above the tree line, who came to town perhaps twice a year for supplies and otherwise kept to himself. The stories about him varied depending on who was telling them, but they all painted him as a man to be avoided, dangerous in ways that went beyond the simple threat of physical violence. Some said he had been a soldier once, that he had seen things in the war that had broken something fundamental inside him. Others claimed he was running from the law, that he had killed a man back east and come to the mountains to escape justice. Still others whispered that he wasn't entirely human, that he had lived alone in the wilderness for so long that he had become something else. Something wild and unpredictable. Ruth had dismissed most of these stories as the kind of folklore that grew around any man who chose to live outside the bounds of civilized society. But she had made a mental note to avoid his property, to give his cabin a wide berth when she was searching for food or shelter. The last thing she needed was to run afoul of a man who might be genuinely dangerous. But as the winter deepened and her options dwindled, she had found herself venturing higher up the mountain, driven by the simple mathematics of survival. The lower elevations had been picked clean by her previous raids, and the townspeople were beginning to take precautions, locking their doors and windows, keeping their food stores more carefully guarded. She needed to find new sources of supply, even if it meant taking greater risks. The storm that had driven her to Brandon Bennett's barn had come out of nowhere, a sudden blizzard that had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of white. She had been making her way back to the line shack with a small bag of potatoes she had taken from a root cellar when the wind had picked up and the snow had begun to fall with frightening intensity. Within minutes, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white, and she had found herself stumbling blindly through drifts that grew deeper with each step. The cold had cut through her thin coat like a knife, and she had known with growing terror that she was lost, that the storm would claim her if she didn't find shelter soon. The barn had appeared out of the swirling snow like a mirage, solid and real and promising salvation from the killing cold. She hadn't stopped to think about whose property she was trespassing on, hadn't considered the consequences of her actions beyond the immediate need for warmth and shelter. She had simply pushed through the door and collapsed in the relative warmth of the hay-filled interior, grateful to be alive. It was only as she had caught her breath and taken stock of her surroundings that she had realized where she was. The barn was well maintained despite its rustic appearance, with tools that showed signs of regular use and care. This was not an abandoned building, but the property of someone who took pride in their work, someone who would not appreciate finding a thief sheltering in their barn. She had considered leaving immediately, braving the storm rather than face the wrath of whoever owned this place. But the wind had been howling like a living thing, and she could see through the gaps in the walls that the snow was falling so thickly that visibility was reduced to mere feet. To venture out into that maelstrom would be suicide, and whatever danger she might face from the barn's owner seemed preferable to certain death in the storm. So she had hidden herself behind the old plow, wrapping herself in her thin coat and trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She had listened to the storm rage outside, had felt the temperature drop even further as night fell, and had tried not to think about what would happen if she was discovered. The sound of approaching footsteps had shattered her fragile sense of security, and she had known with sinking certainty that her refuge had been discovered. The man who owned this barn was coming, and she would have to face whatever consequences awaited her. Now, standing in the dim light of the barn with Brandon Bennett's words hanging in the air between them, Ruth felt the weight of all her choices pressing down on her shoulders. The bread she had stolen seemed to burn against her chest where she clutched it, evidence of her desperation and her crimes. But there was something in this man's eyes, something that didn't match the fearsome reputation that preceded him. "You're the woman who's been taking food around the valley," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice held no accusation, just a simple statement of fact. "People have been talking." Ruth nodded, unable to find her voice. There was no point in denying it now, not when the evidence was literally in her hands. She waited for the anger, for the threats, for him to march her back to town and turn her over to the sheriff. Instead, Brandon stepped back, giving her space to emerge from her hiding place. "Come on, then. Standing there shivering won't help either of us, and this storm's not letting up anytime soon." She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to be cautious, to be afraid. But the cold was seeping through her bones, and she could see her breath misting in the air, despite the shelter of the barn. Slowly, she stepped out from behind the plow, still clutching the bread like a lifeline. Brandon studied her in the dim light, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose on her diminished frame, the desperate exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. When he spoke again, his voice was gentler than she had expected. "When did you last eat something hot?" The question caught her off guard, so different from what she had been expecting, that she could only stare at him. What? A hot meal," he clarified, as if speaking to someone who might not understand the concept. "When did you last have one?" Ruth tried to remember, but the days had blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger. "I don't. It's been a while." Brandon nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The cabin's warmer than the barn, and I've got stew cooking. You can eat, get warm, wait out the storm. In the morning, we'll figure out what comes next." "I can't pay you," Ruth said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't have anything to offer in return. Did I ask for payment?" Brandon's tone was matter-of-fact, neither kind nor unkind, simply practical. "You're half frozen and starving. Basic human decency says I feed you and give you a warm place to sleep. Everything else can wait until morning." Ruth felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. It had been so long since anyone had shown her simple kindness, since anyone had treated her as if she deserved basic human consideration. The emotion threatened to overwhelm her, and she had to look away to maintain her composure. "Why?" she whispered. "Everyone says you're dangerous?" Brandon supplied when she trailed off. "A killer? Mad from too much time alone?" He shrugged, seemingly unbothered by his reputation. "People say a lot of things. Most of them are more interested in a good story than the truth." He moved toward the barn door, pausing to look back at her when she didn't immediately follow. "The offer stands, but I'm not going to force you. You can stay here in the barn if you prefer, but it's going to be a cold night, and that coat of yours won't be enough to keep you alive if the temperature drops much further." Ruth looked around the barn, already feeling the cold creeping in despite the shelter it provided. Then she looked at Brandon. This man whose reputation had preceded him, but who was offering her warmth and food with no strings attached. The choice, when it came down to it, was really no choice at all. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." The walk from the barn to Brandon's cabin was only a few dozen yards, but the wind cut through Ruth's thin coat like a blade, making her grateful for even that short distance. The cabin itself was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that sent smoke spiraling up into the stormy night. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, promising the kind of comfort she had almost forgotten existed. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well appointed. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table in the center. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and various supplies. Everything was neat and organized, the home of a man who took care of his possessions and his space. The warmth hit Ruth like a physical force, making her realize just how cold she had become. She stood just inside the door, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor, unsure of what was expected of her. "Sit by the fire," Brandon said, hanging his own coat on a peg by the door. "Get warm while I dish up some food." Ruth moved toward the fireplace on unsteady legs, sinking into a wooden chair that had been positioned to catch the heat from the flames. The fire was well built, with seasoned wood that burned clean and hot, and she held her hands out toward it, feeling sensation gradually return to her fingers. She watched as Brandon moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, ladling stew from a pot that hung over the coals into two wooden bowls. The smell that rose from the pot made her stomach clench with hunger, rich and savory and more appealing than anything she had smelled in weeks. "It's venison," he said, setting one of the bowls on the table along with a piece of fresh bread and a cup of what looked like coffee. "Shot the deer last week. There's plenty, so don't be shy about eating your fill." Ruth approached the table cautiously, still not quite believing that this was real, that she was sitting in a warm cabin about to eat a hot meal without having to pay for it or work for it or steal it. The first spoonful of stew was like a revelation, rich and flavorful and satisfying in a way that went beyond simple hunger. Brandon sat across from her with his own bowl, eating in comfortable silence while she tried not to wolf down her food like the starving woman she was. But despite her efforts at dignity, she found herself finishing the bowl faster than she had intended, sopping up the last of the gravy with the bread. "More?" Brandon asked, already rising to refill her bowl before she could answer. "I shouldn't," Ruth protested weakly, but she didn't push the bowl away when he set it back in front of her. "You should," he said simply. "You're skin and bones, and this storm's going to last through the night. You need the strength." As she ate the second bowl more slowly, savoring each bite, Ruth found herself studying her host. Brandon Bennett was not what she had expected based on the stories she had heard. He was certainly large and imposing, with a kind of physical presence that came from years of hard work and outdoor living. But there was nothing wild or dangerous about his manner. If anything, he seemed almost gentle, moving around his cabin with quiet efficiency and treating her with a courtesy she hadn't experienced in months. "You're not what people say you are," she said finally, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Brandon looked up from his own meal, one eyebrow raised in question. "What do people say I am?" Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly embarrassed by her boldness. "They say you're dangerous, that you've killed people, that you went mad from living alone up here." "And what do you think?" he asked, his tone giving nothing away. Ruth considered the question seriously, looking around the well-maintained cabin, thinking about the way he had found her in his barn and offered her food and shelter instead of turning her over to the authorities. "I think people are afraid of what they don't understand, and they don't understand why anyone would choose to live alone." Brandon nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied him in some way. "I came up here after the war," he said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Needed some quiet, some space to think." The quiet turned into months, then years. By the time I might have been ready to come back down, I realized I didn't want to anymore. "What about the stories?" Ruth asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was none of her business, and she had no right to pry into this man's past, especially when he was showing her such kindness. But Brandon didn't seem offended by her curiosity. He finished his stew and pushed the bowl away, leaning back in his chair as he considered his answer. "There was a man," he said finally, 3 years ago. "He came up here looking for trouble, thought he could take what he wanted because I lived alone and no one would know or care. He was wrong about that." Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You killed him?" "Uh, me? I defended myself and my property," Brandon said, his voice steady and without emotion. He drew on me first, but that's not the story that made it back to town. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, especially when people want to believe them. Ruth nodded, understanding more than she cared to admit about how quickly rumors could spread and how little they resembled the truth. She had been the subject of whispered conversations herself, had felt the weight of judgment from people who knew nothing about her circumstances or her choices. "What about you?" Brandon asked, turning the conversation back to her. "What's your story? How does a woman end up stealing food and sleeping in barns in the middle of winter?" Ruth felt her defenses rise automatically, the habit of months of protecting herself from prying questions and unwanted sympathy. But something about Brandon's manner, the way he asked without judgment or condescension, made her want to answer honestly. "My husband died 2 years ago," she said, the words coming easier than they had in a long time. "Logging accident. I tried to keep up with the mortgage payments, but without his income." She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the small tragedies and daily humiliations that had followed Jacob's death. "The bank foreclosed," Brandon said, and again it wasn't a question. "Thomas Castillo gave me as much time as he could, but business is business." Ruth heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to soften it. "I found work at Gloria Carter's boarding house, but that didn't work out either." "Gloria Carter's a hard woman," Brandon observed, "known for being difficult to work for." Ruth let out a laugh that held no humor. "That's putting it kindly. She seemed to take pleasure in making me feel worthless, in reminding me daily that I was there on her charity. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. And started taking what you needed to survive," Brandon finished. Ruth nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. "I told myself I would pay it back someday, when I got back on my feet. But I know that's probably just something I tell myself to feel better about being a thief." "Survival makes thieves of us all eventually," Brandon said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he spoke from experience. "The question is, what you do when you don't have to steal anymore." Ruth looked up at him, surprised by the implication in his words. "What do you mean?" Brandon stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm that continued to rage outside. The snow was falling so thickly that the barn was barely visible through the white curtain. "This storm's going to last through tomorrow, maybe longer," he said. "Even when it clears, it'll be days before the roads are passable again. You're welcome to stay until then, but after that, you'll need to make some decisions about what comes next." Ruth felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had been so focused on the immediate relief of warmth and food that she hadn't thought beyond the next few hours. But Brandon was right, of course. The storm would end eventually, and she would have to face the same problems that had driven her to desperation in the first place. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted quietly. "No family, no friends who could take me in, and after what I've done, I can't go back to town." Brandon turned from the window to study her, his expression thoughtful. "What if you didn't have to go back to town? What if there was another option?" "Should." Ruth felt a flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile. "What kind of option?" I could use help around here," Brandon said, his tone carefully neutral. "The cabin needs work. There's always firewood to cut and stack, food to preserve, 100 other tasks that are easier with 2 people than 1. In return, you'd have a roof over your head, regular meals, and honest work instead of stealing." The offer hung in the air between them. Too good to be true, and yet spoken with such matter-of-fact sincerity that Ruth found herself wanting to believe it. But years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious about hope. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me. I could be lazy or dishonest or any number of things that would make me a poor choice for a partner." "Could be," Brandon agreed. "But I don't think you are. A lazy person doesn't survive what you've survived. A dishonest person doesn't feel shame about stealing when they're starving. And a person without character doesn't worry about being a burden to someone who's offering help." Ruth felt tears threaten again, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of his words. It had been so long since anyone had seen anything worthwhile in her, since anyone had treated her as if she had value beyond what she could provide in labor or payment. "What would people say?" she asked, grasping for objections even as part of her desperately wanted to accept his offer. A man and woman living alone together, unmarried. The scandal would. "Would what?" Brandon interrupted gently. "Hurt your reputation in a town you can never go back to? Offend people who've already written you off as a thief in a charity case? He shook his head. The opinions of people who've never faced real hardship don't matter much when you're trying to survive. Ruth knew he was right, but the ingrained habits of propriety died hard, even in the face of desperate circumstances. She had been raised to care about appearances, to value the good opinion of her community, and those lessons were difficult to abandon even when that community had abandoned her. Think about it, Brandon said, seeming to sense her internal struggle. You don't have to decide tonight. Sleep on it. See how you feel in the morning when the storm's past, and you can think more clearly. He moved to a chest in the corner of the room and pulled out several thick blankets, which he arranged on a small cot near the fireplace. You can sleep here where it's warm. I'll take the back room. Ruth watched him prepare the makeshift bed with the same quiet efficiency he had shown in everything else. The blankets looked clean and well-maintained, and the cot, while simple, was far more comfortable than anything she had slept on in weeks. I don't know how to thank you, she said as he finished arranging the bedding. No need for thanks, Brandon replied. Just get some rest. Tomorrow we'll see what the weather looks like and go from there. He disappeared into what she assumed was his bedroom, leaving her alone by the fire with her thoughts and the sound of the storm outside. Ruth changed into her nightgown behind the privacy of a blanket hung from the rafters, then settled onto the cot with a deep sigh of relief. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. For the first time in months, she felt safe, truly safe, and the sensation was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Ruth lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Brandon's offer. The practical part of her mind cataloged all the reasons it made sense. She would have shelter, food, meaningful work, and the chance to rebuild her life away from the judgment and pity of the townspeople below. But another part of her, the part that had been shaped by years of conventional thinking about what was proper and appropriate, recoiled from the idea of living alone with a man she barely knew. Yet as she lay there in the warmth and safety of his cabin, listening to the storm rage outside, she found it difficult to muster much concern for propriety. What did convention matter when the alternative was freezing to death or starving in the wilderness? What did reputation matter when she had already lost everything that had once defined her place in the world? She thought about Jacob, about what he would have wanted for her. He had been a practical man, more concerned with substance than appearance, and she thought he would have understood the choice she was facing. He would have wanted her to survive, to find a way to build a new life, even if it wasn't the life they had planned together. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, just as Brandon had predicted. Ruth woke to find him already up and moving around the cabin, tending the fire and preparing breakfast with the same quiet competence he had shown the night before. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, rich and welcoming, and utterly different from the cold and hunger that had been her constant companions for so long. Storm's still going strong, he said when he noticed she was awake. Probably won't clear until tomorrow at the earliest. Ruth sat up on the cot, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She hadn't had access to a proper mirror in weeks, and she could only imagine what she must look like after months of poor nutrition and inadequate shelter. There's a wash basin and some soap on the table by the window, Brandon said, as if reading her thoughts. Take your time getting ready. Breakfast will keep. The simple luxury of hot water and soap was almost overwhelming. Ruth washed her face and hands, then did what she could with her hair, which had grown longer than she usually wore it and had lost much of its former luster. But even these small acts of self-care made her feel more human, more like the woman she had been before desperation had stripped away so many of the small dignities that had once defined her daily life. Breakfast was another revelation. Eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits with butter and jam. Ruth tried to eat slowly, to savor each bite, but her body's demands for nutrition made restraint difficult. Brandon ate his own meal without comment, occasionally glancing out the window at the continuing storm, but otherwise seeming content with the silence. Tell me about the work you mentioned, Ruth said finally, needing to break the quiet that had settled between them. What would you need me to do? Brandon looked up from his plate, considering the question. Depends on the season and what needs doing. Right now, with winter coming on, it would be mostly indoor work, cooking, cleaning, mending clothes and equipment. Come spring, there's a garden to plant and tend, food to preserve for next winter, firewood to cut and stack for the year after that. I know how to do those things, Ruth said, feeling a flicker of confidence for the first time in months. I kept house for Jacob and myself for 5 years. I'm not afraid of hard work. I didn't think you were, Brandon replied. A woman who's survived what you've survived doesn't get there by being afraid of work. Ruth felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a feeling she recognized as the return of something she had thought lost forever. Pride in herself and her abilities. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged her competence, her strength, that she had almost forgotten she possessed those qualities. The conversation continued throughout the morning as the storm raged outside, covering practical matters like sleeping arrangements and work schedules, but also touching on deeper questions about what their partnership would look like. Brandon was clear that he expected her to pull her weight, that this would be a working arrangement rather than charity, and Ruth found herself grateful for his directness. She had had enough of pity and condescension to last a lifetime. What about supplies? She asked. Clothing, personal items, things I'll need if I'm going to stay through the winter? We'll make a list, Brandon said. Next time I go to town, I'll pick up what you need. Or if you prefer, once the worst of the winter's over and travel's easier, you could come with me. Ruth shook her head immediately. I can't go back to town. Too many people know what I've done, and I can't face their judgment. Fair enough, Brandon said without argument, though you might be surprised how quickly people forget and move on to newer scandals. But there's no need to worry about that now. Winter's a good time for staying close to home anyway. As the day wore on and the storm continued, Ruth found herself settling into the rhythm of life in the cabin. She helped Brandon with the daily tasks of maintaining their shelter, cooking meals and tending the fire, and discovered that domestic work felt different when it was done as an equal partner rather than as a servant or charity case. There was dignity in contributing to their mutual survival, in being valued for her skills and effort rather than merely tolerated. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ruth made her decision. I'd like to accept your offer, she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could second-guess herself. If you're still willing to have me, I'd like to stay and work with you. Brandon looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression unreadable in the firelight. You're sure? It's not an easy life up here, especially in winter. And once you commit to staying, it'll be months before you could change your mind and leave. I'm sure, Ruth said, and was surprised to find that she truly was. I don't have anywhere else to go, and I'd rather work hard for someone who treats me with respect than beg for charity from people who see me as a burden. Brandon nodded slowly, as if her answer satisfied him. All right then. We'll shake on it and call it settled. He extended his hand across the space between their chairs, and Ruth took it, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work, the strength that came from a life lived outdoors. His grip was firm and warm, and when he spoke, his voice carried a formality that made the moment feel significant. Partners then, he said, equal shares in the work and equal shares in whatever we manage to build here. Partners, Ruth agreed, and felt something inside her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally begin to relax. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The landscape outside the cabin was pristine and beautiful, with drifts piled high against the barn and trees heavy with their white burden. The sun shone brilliantly against the snow, creating a glare that made Ruth squint as she looked out the window. Beautiful, isn't it? Brandon said, coming to stand beside her. This is why I stay up here. Moments like this, when the world looks like it's been remade overnight. Ruth nodded, understanding something about him that she hadn't grasped before. This wasn't just a place of exile for him, a retreat from civilization. It was home in the truest sense, a place that fed his soul in ways that the crowded, complicated world below never could. Over the following weeks, as winter settled in earnest over the mountain, Ruth discovered that her new life held challenges she hadn't anticipated, but also rewards that surprised her with their richness. The work was indeed hard, as Brandon had warned, but it was honest work with visible results. Each meal cooked, each garment mended, each cord of wood stacked contributed directly to their survival and comfort. More surprisingly, she found herself enjoying Brandon's company in ways she hadn't expected. He was a thoughtful man, well-read despite his isolation, and their evening conversations by the fire ranged over topics she hadn't discussed with anyone since Jacob's death. He treated her opinions with respect, listened to her thoughts without condescension, and gradually she began to remember what it felt like to be valued for her mind as well as her labor. The physical transformation was equally remarkable. Regular meals and meaningful work began to restore her health and strength, and she could see in the mirror that her face was filling out, that her eyes had regained some of their former brightness. She was becoming herself again, or perhaps becoming someone new, someone stronger than the woman who had been broken by loss and hardship. As Christmas approached, Ruth realized that she was happier than she had been in years. The simple rhythms of their shared life, the satisfaction of work well done, the quiet companionship that had developed between them, all combined to create a sense of contentment she had thought lost forever. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey Brandon had been saving for a special occasion, Ruth found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this place. The loss and grief, the desperation and fear, the moment of discovery in the barn when she had thought her story might end in tragedy, all of it had led to this: a warm cabin, honest work, and a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, the whiskey making her bold. "Choosing to live up here, away from everything?" Brandon considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "Sometimes I wonder what my life might have been like if I'd made different choices. But regret? No. This is where I belong, and now you're here too. And it feels right." Ruth felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the whiskey or the fire. "It does feel right," she agreed. "I never thought I'd say that about anything again, but it does." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, adding to the blanket that covered their mountain home. Ruth watched the flakes drift past the window and thought about the woman who had hidden in Brandon's barn just weeks ago, desperate and afraid, and certain that her story was ending in failure. That woman had been wrong. Her story hadn't been ending at all. It had been beginning, transforming from a tale of loss and desperation into something richer and more complex. She had found not just survival in this place, but renewal, not just shelter but home. "You'll sleep beside me tonight," Brandon had said that first evening, and she had feared what those words might mean. Now she understood that they had meant safety, partnership, and the beginning of a new chapter in a life she had thought was over. In choosing to trust him, in choosing to stay and build something together, she had found not just a place to survive the winter, but a place to thrive for all the seasons to come. The mountain had tested her, had stripped away everything she thought she needed to be happy, and in the end had given her something better: the knowledge that she was strong enough to start over, brave enough to build a new life, and worthy of the respect and partnership of a good man who saw her value when she had forgotten it herself. As the fire crackled and the snow fell and the whiskey warmed her from within, Ruth Ortiz smiled and knew that she was exactly where she belonged.